Hello, this is Anna. This is my final presentation for John's writings, answering the question, what is my eschatological viewpoint? So, obviously, there are many opinions surrounding how to interpret Revelation. Some people hold really strongly to specific views. Some people are more open-minded, but certainly have an opinion, and some people don't even understand what the positions of eschatology are. I definitely fall somewhere between those last two categories. It wasn't really till this past semester that I started to get more of a formal exposure to the eschatological views. Part of that's probably because when I was little, I was super afraid of this book, because my cousin and I would go and read it in a dark room like a horror story. And when I would see the moon turning orange, I would freak out because I thought it was turning blood red and so many things like that. Um, but anyway, that actually brings me to another point, and that is simply that a lot of my life I've understood or even been taught that Revelation should be interpreted in a like almost a literal only, future only type of way, which has made it a little bit more difficult. But it's also been really interesting to be able to step back with what we've been learning to just take more of a open-minded look at the different ways to interpret Revelation. So, one thing though that I think it's important to point out is, interestingly, you don't see a lot of the same emphasis on looking at the background and the genre of Revelation as you do when people interpret a lot of other books of the Bible, which I think is odd, and I think it could add a lot of clarity to the discussion surrounding eschatological viewpoints. Because I don't think that you can properly interpret any book of the Bible without first examining the background, the genre of the book, and I don't think that Revelation should be any different than that. So I'm going to really quick go through that. The background of Revelation, the author is John the Apostle. He was the youngest disciple. He was exiled to Patmos, and he was exiled because at the time there was significant persecution going on for the early church. This was probably either under Nero or Domitian, but the Christians to whom he was writing were undergoing a lot of severe trials. Which is really important to keep in mind that when we're reading this book, it was written to those specific believers and to be circulated throughout the churches. I think it's really important to remember the biblical audience to whom it was written, even though, of course, it has meaning and application for us today. The genre is prophetic, clearly. I recently read this past semester The Message of the Prophets by J. Daniel Hayes. He gave a really good definition of prophetic literature. These books are made up primarily of oracles and visions of Yahweh, often delivered by the prophet in the form of a short spoken or preached message. Much of the material is conveyed through colorful poetic language, packed tightly with colorful word plays and graphic figures of speech. He also said it's difficult to compare this type of literature to any other that's really in our culture at this time. Beyond being just prophetic, though, it's also apocalyptic in style. And Revelation isn't the only book written with the apocalyptic style. I didn't realize that. I think for most of my life I thought it was. Like the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, for example, also contains this apocalyptic style. What exactly does this style contain? Again, Hayes' definition is, although all prophetic literature uses images, figures of speech, and poetic language, in apocalyptic literature the language is characterized by a high degree of visionary symbolism, often appearing quite bizarre to the modern reader. He said, interestingly, that apocalyptic literature isn't completely without parallel in our day, because political cartoons have similarities. This comes about simply because we use a lot of interesting visual representations for literal things. So, political parties, for instance, Republicans are represented by the elephant, Democrats are represented by the donkey. If you kind of think about any political cartoon that you've seen and then try to figure out exactly how that would be explained in like a vision form, it kind of starts to give you an idea of how this symbolic imagery can be difficult to like put into words and make it hard to understand. You might see animals in weird shapes and sizes, with weird exaggerated characteristics with words on them, similar to what we see when John's trying to explain what he saw in his vision. So it's kind of important to realize that even though a lot of the things that we hear in the book seem kind of absurd, this is kind of where he's coming from, and you can understand that through like the way we see political cartoons today. I thought that was really interesting. But I also want to point out lastly, before I get into what my viewpoint is, that I think we can gain a lot from looking at prophecies that we've seen the fulfillments of and seeing how exactly they appeared and how difficult it might have been to interpret them correctly. For instance, Genesis 3:15, it's a really well-known verse set in the context of God's verdict on mankind after Adam and Eve fell. That verse says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." I just wonder how many of us, without any previous knowledge of how we know that it was fulfilled, would have been able to interpret this passage correctly. Would we have been able to know that this verse was talking about the Son of God being killed on a cross, so being struck on the heel, as it were, and then Jesus would also rise from the dead victorious over Satan, and that is represented through the crushing of the serpent's head part. I just think it's kind of foolhardy to claim that we can definitively know how to interpret such a difficult and mysterious genre as this prophetic apocalyptic style that we see in Revelation. So, back to Revelation. What are the primary interpretive theories anyway? The three primary views that we discussed in class are amillennial, historic premillennial, and dispensational premillennial. So the amillennial focuses on interpreting Revelation in basically an allegorical way. So according to the definition in class, this view believes that Revelation is current history written in code to confound enemies of the church and encourage Asian Christians. Yet the message of the book applies to all Christians. Historic premillennial is, according to the definition in class, Revelation is applicable to the Asian Christians and it applies to all Christians in all ages, but John's vision looks towards a great future event. And dispensational premillennial is Revelation unveils Christ among the church in this present time and as judge and king in the times to come. So I could definitely spend a lot of time pointing out the pluses and minuses of all those views extensively, but I don't have time for that. So I really just point out the one main danger that I see in one of these views, and that is the amillennial perspective. There are many commentators that take this allegorical interpretive viewpoint for interpreting Revelation. I think that sometimes this can be a dangerous approach to interpreting scripture unless it's stated in the Bible that it should be interpreted as such. I really liked this quote from the interpreter's commentary, which said, "The danger of allegorizing is that the original intent and meaning of the text are obscured by unwarranted subjective flights of fancy." So because it is prophetic, of course, we're going to have to take a lot of those symbols and give them a different spiritual and literal meaning. I just think that you need to be really careful when you say that a whole book should be interpreted allegorically, because it kind of leaves it up to a lot of subjective opinion. I don't really have strong feelings about either the historic premillennial view or the dispensational premillennial view. My only outstanding objection to the historic view is that it seems to assume that the church has replaced Israel completely, and I do believe that there will be promises fulfilled in and for the actual nation of Israel. So, as I said at the beginning, I can't say that I have one primary eschatological view, and honestly, the more that I look at all the perspectives, the more I see merit in them all. I actually just reread Revelation today, and I can absolutely see why so many people want to interpret it with like that allegorical, like symbolic interpretation, because a lot of the visuals are just really incomprehensible. Some of the figures of speech are just super crazy and hard to understand. Especially if you're only using a literal interpretation. Will there really be grasshoppers, scorpion creatures? Will the angels really have bowls and pour out their contents? I don't know. One thing I did want to say is that on earth, some things might look different than in the spiritual realm. What's going on spiritually, you might be able to interpret Revelation literally for the spiritual perspective, and it might look different, more like the allegorical perspective on earth. I think we just need to be ready for when Jesus comes. So thank you.